We are going to be 10 billion by 2050. We are going to live on a planet 4 degrees hotter. We are going to have more mouths and less food. We are going to have less land and more pollution. But we crossed oceans and we defeated diseases. But we went to the moon and we blossomed the desert. Because we are innovators. We are farmers. We are makers. We are dreamers. And we are going to gather and discuss, create and inspire minds and souls. Because we are feeding our future.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am here today to share my perspective that, in the bigger picture, represents that of my generation, the Generation Z. And it is important for teenagers like myself to take on active roles in conferences regarding sustainability and the evolving role of food in our society, because in the near future, we'll be the ones who will have to take on the role of making the change. And speaking of change, what I realized is that to make the big changes, we need to start small. And say that I want to eat an apple. I want to know if this apple is from Italy, France, China, India. I want to know its levels of sodium, fiber, antioxidants, but most important of all, I want to know if it's compatible with my needs. And this is what the Semantic Web of Food helps us to do. In fact, the Internet of Food makes this information accessible. And this is important because just yesterday on the newspaper, I was reading about luxury hotels having an argument of food classified as Series B being sold. Well, this is not possible with the Semantic Web of Food acting at the maximum of its potential. Ultimately, the Semantic Web of Food truly represents an evolution of human knowledge as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really, really great to be here. Such a pleasure. This conference started 3 years ago, and I happened to be part of it then as well. And I don't know if Sarah Roversi's in the room. She was the one who invited me to the first Seeds and Chips. So Sarah, wherever you are, this is a shout out to you. A big thank you. And I also wanted to thank Marco, and using the California slang, dude, thank you. This is really great. It's great to be a part of, and I hope that we continue to have a long and wonderful relationship together with Seeds and Chips and Icy Foods. I also wanted to make sure to thank Sharon Chitone. I don't know if she's in here, but her tireless efforts in bringing this together. I couldn't have done it without either one of them, for sure. And finally, our sponsor, SOP, for helping us bring these very famous speakers that we have for you. And in fact, I'd like to invite them up now, because we wouldn't have a Semantic Web of Food, we wouldn't have the beginning of it without all of these people. So please, my panel, please come up and join me. And it's going to be amazing. What's coming in the world now is truly, truly amazing. And we have academics, government officials, and forward-thinking business people who are going to tell you how all of this is going to happen. The Semantic Web of Food is really meant to build a common language across the environment, ag, food, diet, health, knowledge spectrum, right? Right now, what we have is we have a situation where large corporations are doing things like greenwashing, where we take words and we make alternative facts out of them, and you don't really know what you're getting. Slide. And, but just as a sort of a lighthearted approach, last night I got here kind of late off the plane, and I was looking at the restaurant menu just before I went to bed, and I ordered sea bass. And I had in my mind that I was going to, thank you very much. that I was going to get a dish that looked something like this, or perhaps something like this. I was really looking forward to having some potatoes or some nice starch, like maybe a risotto to go with the fish. Of course, I'm in Italy, so probably that's not going to happen together. Maybe something, something like this, one of those things. And I thought, wow, I can't wait to get my sea bass. And then this is what came. And I realized, wow, there's a problem with language at its most basic level, which this fish was actually delicious, by the way, and I'm not complaining about Italian food, because every time I come here, I think I'm going to get fat, but I haven't figured it out, because when I come here and I eat, I actually, I eat a lot more than I eat at home, but somehow I lose weight, and I don't understand how that works. Still would like to figure that out. That's a burning scientific question. Really, what the Semantic Web of Food is all about decision support. Decision support systems anywhere along that ag, food, diet, health, knowledge spectrum. Most importantly, it's about traceability as well, right? So we can trace foods back to their origination points. It's also about transparency, right? We heard last year, the panel that I was on here at Seeds and Chips, we heard from the CEO of Telspec tell us about a situation where they were scanning with their spectrometer flour that came from China and found that it was about 30% human hair. So we need some transparency into what's available in our foods. How do we figure that out? We've got some solutions on the floor here today. It's all about sustainability, authenticity, health, and deliciousness. That's why we're doing traceable, transparent, and trustworthy. Because when we say something's trustworthy, we know that it's going to be sustainable, authentic, healthy, and delicious. So the Internet of Food at its heart is 4 main components. It's data that emerges from food from traditional sources, government sources, company sources, what have you. We also have this emerging thing that today's talk about is about the Semantic Web of Food, so that we have a secure, reliable vocabulary source that we can tag data with, and as well as the Internet of Things for food. So sensors that are all along the ag, food, diet, health, knowledge spectrum are producing data about food, and those can be tagged with terms from the semantic web, and then those can be laid down in a secure fashion in a blockchain where we can have secure contracts, and we'll hear from Raja Ramachandran and Ripe.io about those technologies. The reality is that we've got sensors all around us, in the water, on the land, in the built environment, on the farm, in our tractors, and most importantly, even in our phone. Our phones are more powerful than the computers we sent the man to the moon with. So what can we do with all that data? In fact, it's not just the data that emerges from the Internet of Things. We also have models that we use, climate forecasts, crop modeling. We use this is important for industry, for commodity exchange, and also for insurance, crop insurance. So we need to be speaking the same language, whether we're talking about the genomics of food or whether we're talking about computer scientific models at the global scale. And in fact, we want to know about it from a consumer point of view as well. I can ask Google, when was Einstein's wife born? And Google knows what I mean when I ask that question. It knows because underlying that is the friend of a friend ontology. An ontology, a vocabulary system that describes what a person is, what their attributes are, and the kinds of relationships they exist in. I can do the same thing in Facebook when I ask a natural language question about my friends who might have visited Disneyland last year. I'll see their pictures. Facebook knows what I mean when I ask a regular question. Well, we have a variety of experts here today that you're going to hear from who are going to walk us through all of these vocabulary systems that are being built now, and some of them are actually well established. We'll hear from Tom Baker tell us about the Global Agricultural Concept Schema. We'll hear Valeria Pesce tell us about what's going on with the UN FAO and the Global Forum for Agricultural Research, and the AgroVoc vocabulary and the family of vocabularies related to it. And we'll also hear from Damian Dooley with the Food On vocabulary that you can use to tag food data with. This is food product data. And there's a variety of other players who are involved, which if you're interested in all of this, you can hit me up on social media, If you didn't see the name up there, it's at Mateo Lan, and you can also hit at IC3 Foods. So we have other vocabularies that we're building that can describe sustainability in terms of all kinds of sustainability issues. This is a paper that was produced by some colleagues of mine at the Ag Sustainability Institute. And we're also producing vocabulary systems that describe food processing and ultimately the type of sensory experience that you can have as a result of a gene of a specific type, maybe, a food of a specific type of variety that has specific genes underneath it, that's been through a series of processing steps and now has a resulting sensory experience. And if you just look at these words, these are pictures of the ontology. You can see, for instance, if I look over here, it's like this decorticating process. Now, I would hazard to guess that most people have never heard of the word decorticating process, or even the word decortication. It means to remove the outer layer of something. But the reality is that we need to learn more about food. We need to actually, describe food in greater detail. 15 years ago, most people on the street couldn't have told you what a font is. They couldn't know if you asked them for something in trebuchet font. Nobody would know what the heck you were talking about unless they were a graphics designer or unless they were, involved in publication industry. So as fields emerge, our vocabulary grows, right? And so I think that as the semantic web of food emerges, we're going to have more terms to describe food, more terms to describe the processes that we do it. We also need to be precise with our health system. Right now, this gene right here, it's my favorite gene acronym there is, MTHFR, MTHFR. It actually stands for methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. And it's responsible for, for converting this molecule here, 5,10-methylene THF, into 5-methyl-THF, which then goes, the importance of this is it goes from homocysteine to methionine. You didn't know you're getting a biochemistry lecture here today. The important thing to remember here is, just like American politics, red is bad and blue is good, and that B12 is a requirement. So if you have a polymorphism in MTHFR, it turns out, which 50% of Italian women have a polymorphism in this gene, right? Well, it turns out that you shouldn't eat so much protein and you shouldn't exercise so vigorously unless you're bumping up your B12 and your riboflavin, by the way, and your folate. So here we are giving advice to people to engage in certain activities, to consume certain diets, like lean meats and vigorous exercise, and we're giving them the wrong advice. We're giving a certain segment of the population wrong advice. We can do better than that. We have better technology than that. So there's another aspect of this semantic web of food that we need to focus on. The fact is that if we look across our medical vocabularies worldwide, so at the National Institute of Health in the NIH in Washington, D.C., we have this unified medical language system, the UMLS. All of the vocabularies about medicine from all around the world are in the UMLS. Nursing vocabularies, doctor vocabularies, international classification of disease, you name it. In that vocabulary, we have 1,000 unique terms to describe the word depression. And I don't mean depression like if you got hit in the head with a pipe and you've got a depression in your skull. I mean depression like you're sad, right? So 1,000 terms, over 1,000 terms to describe depression. Yet we have 60 terms to describe the word happiness. That's it. And as it turns out, 40 of those refer to unhappiness. So mostly, the vocabulary systems that we've built around health are based on disease. They're not actually telling us about the positive aspects of health. They're not telling us how to be happier, how we can engage in activities that will make us happy. We need to define happiness a little bit better than this, right? And what brings us happiness more than sharing a meal with our family? We're back to, okay. Schema.org is a large vocabulary that runs a lot of the shopping and product search online. And I'm delighted to say that we are moving forward with engaging with Schema.org to make the Internet of Food subdomain that will draw from these vocabularies that you're going to hear from our experts talk about. And these are a couple of the speakers that we had at the IC Foods conference last November. And you can see they range from scientific publishers like Elsevier, as well as large companies like Bayer and DSM and Givaudan, and even big consumers of food like Google. You wouldn't realize it, but Google actually feeds 100,000 people 3 times a day, every day. So they buy a lot of food, and they're very interested in delivering food sustainably and healthily to their employees. Now, I know a lot of people are talking about local foods and small production, and I think that's important, but if we want the semantic web of food to actually take hold, then the large food producers actually need to be part of this as well. And so it's important to include them in the conversation. So next November, we're having our second conference for IC Foods, and by all means, visit the website, hit us up on social media if you want to be part of that. And again, a lot of what we're building here is an infrastructure where we can allow and enable companies to compete, to be more sustainable, to be more authentic, to be healthier and more delicious. So this is not a top-down approach where we're demanding people to do things. This is a bottom-up approach where we're building an infrastructure that enables markets to compete, to deliver the things that we know are all important. And so again, thank you to our sponsors. And at this time, I'd like to bring up Nick Holden. He's a professor of biosystems engineering at University College Dublin, and he's going to tell us a little bit about tracking foods through the entire life cycle.
So I'd like to thank Matt and our sponsors for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak. So I'm not going to talk about the semantic web of food as such. That's not something I'm an expert in. But I'm going to talk about why I think it's so important. And I'm going to put it in the context of the research that I do. And what I'm interested in is understanding the sustainability of food. And I use a particular method a lot of the time, life cycle assessment. So in case any of you aren't aware of what that is, it's effectively a mass flow accounting method where we look at the whole of a system that supplies a product, process, or service, and we try to quantify all of the mass flow, all of the energy flow, all of the money, all of the social interactions associated with that, and then calculate what kind of impacts arise from the system. So the thing that most people are familiar with that comes from LCA is carbon footprinting, but that's not LCA because it's a single impact. The real beauty of LCA is that it allows us to look at competing impacts. If I solve one problem, do I create another? And because we look at this in a whole system approach, it really is the perfect example of where we need the semantic web of food and where we need vocabularies and consistency. So the problem as I see it is that our food is unsustainable. I don't think I'm preaching to the unconverted here to reverse the metaphor that we use. I think most people who are interested in technology associated with food are interested because they recognize that food has a significant impact. And in terms of being sustainable, if we have an adverse environmental impact, if it's not socially acceptable, if it's not economically viable, then we know our food can't be sustainable. And we see impacts such as climate change, eutrophication, indirect and direct human health, adverse nutrition outcome, social injustice, price versus value. There's loads and loads of impacts. I'm just picking on the first couple that came to mind when I was writing this. But we also have the concept of our food being fossil. This is one that we don't think about so much. But when we analyze where food as a whole system comes from, then we have to consider that it's fossil, and that means it fails the other test of sustainability, that future generations can use the resources and have the advantages we have just as well as we do. And if you're not convinced by that, you just need to think about the reliance on fossil fuel, the fact we reach peak phosphorus in about 2027 in most parts of the world, groundwater depletion around the world, China and Pakistan being two key ones that are obviously very important. The issue of soil erosion. If the US keeps losing soil at the rate it has done since industrial agriculture, it will not have sufficient soil to produce its food crops in about 100 years, maybe 150. And then we have the overall idea of land degradation. So if we want to fix this problem and we want to find a solution, then we need a way of being able to understand all these things and how they interact, and we need the language to do that. So what we do is we try to derive this understanding using life cycle assessment. So we look at products, we look at a process, or we look at a service. We're particularly interested in my research group at looking at these, at what in Europe at least is called a technology readiness level 1, 2, or 3. So when people have new ideas, it's way, way too late to be looking at these things once people have invested. So when we have a good idea, we want to test whether it really is as good as we think it is. And as we roll through the technology readiness levels to piloting and deployment, we want to see that the decisions that we make still allow that good idea to be good. And we can do that for a product such as raw milk, a process such as producing cheese, or something like whey valorization, where we're providing a service to solve a waste problem. So if we assume we operate within the planetary boundary, which at the moment is a reasonable assumption, we harvest energy from that, which is usually non-renewable, but some of it is now renewable. We use the land and we produce our basic biological commodities from that, our plants and animal commodities. And we also harvest other minerals, metals, and phosphorus and such like, which we then put into a production system. So even at this simple level, if you break that down into the number of unit processes that those 6 arrows and those 4 icons hide, it's actually thousands, even for a relatively simple processed food product such as a TV dinner kind of thing. And even the more recent things that we've seen emerging, the very healthy kind of products, they still have significant amounts of these resource consumptions associated with them. They then go into the whole supply chain to you, the consumer. We've got the logistics, we've got the retail stage, we've got the shopping part, we store this in our fridge. And again, each of those arrows hides a whole series of unit processes. And if we think about the stakeholders who own these, they all talk slightly different languages, be that real languages, different Italian versus English, or they use the same words differently, and these are problems. We then produce our meal, and that has some nutritional outcome, and that's something that we're interested in, but I'm not really going to focus on now and I don't focus on in my own work. But then we waste a load of this. And in Europe, we're wasting significant amounts of food, and I don't think we're the only part in the world that does that. And this means that we've got issues of disposal. We've got to do something with that wasted food, or we've got to try and valorize it and make something good from it. And if we look at an LCA as the diagram is now, that will be considered cradle to gate. And that would be the traditional LCA we do. And we have other wastes coming into this as well, which we might include. What we're moving to with the idea of bioeconomy and circular economy is that we're trying to valorize these wastes, so-called, and we shouldn't call them wastes anymore if we do that, and feed them back into the system. But it's worth pointing out there's nothing you can do with a piece of food, an item of food, which will offset the impact of having created it. So if you have a piece of meat and you throw it away, or you have a piece of meat and you try and valorize it and, say, recover nutrient or fiber from it, there is nothing you can do in doing that which will offset the investment of fossil resources to produce it in the first place. So bioeconomy and circular economy is positive, but when we think of it in the whole life cycle, it's not necessarily a solution to close that loop unless we consider all of the impacts that happen before we close the loop. So what I'm interested in is trying to look at environmental impact, social impact, financial impact, and bring them all together into life cycle sustainability assessment. And this means if I come up with a solution to fix something like climate change, I can find out whether that's going to have an impact on social justice or whether it's going to be financially viable. And with the life cycle costing, we also look at the non-financial component. So all of the value of the ecosystem that we use, the natural capital that we use, that allows us to have food that we don't actually pay for. So I know, for instance, for a litre of milk in Ireland where I live, if we paid for the ecosystem services, we could never make a profit on the milk. It's just not possible within the way the system is currently set up. So what we want to be able to do, and this is where most of these guys come in, is we want to be able to sense this system. We want to be able to collect as much data as possible so that all the data we have behind those arrows and all those unit processes can be quantified, can be empirical, real observations rather than guesses, estimates, best estimate type of things. We want to do that for mass flows, energy flows, social flows, financial flows, anything associated with the system. We want to do that in the processing part of the total system and in the logistics and consumption part. And we want to see the interaction of all these. And this is the key to the semantic web. If we don't have the same ideas connected with the same language that can be tagged in the same way across all these parts, then we're not in a position to put it together. So what we really need is common language, interoperability, access and sharing, which doesn't necessarily mean free. It just means if I'm doing business in one way, you can do business with me because we're using the same type of language. We need the sensors, we need the networks, we need the analytics to make sense of it. We need secure transactions so that the information that flows with the mass is trustworthy, which leads us to trust. We need to be thinking of the system and not the product, process, or service. It has to be the collective whole. So what we're doing at UCD, just to finish up, is we're engaged in research from farm scale to system scale to try and come up with specific solutions to bits of this. But as a huge problem, it's almost intractable. It's almost unimaginable at the moment. And then the other part on our educational mandate is, I think we're the first people in the world who are actually now training agricultural science students to be expert in agriculture, but also data science. So we've got graduates who are ready to work in this space and move it forward in the future. So I'd just like to acknowledge the sponsors again, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick.
Do you want this?
Yeah, no, it's okay. Thank you very much, Nick. That's awesome. I think you all can see now the ocean boiling exercise that is at our feet in terms of building a common language for food. But the person who's got the best handle on that is fortunately sitting just to Nick's left. I'd like to introduce Valeria Pesce. She is a program manager for the Global Agricultural Forum.
Global Forum on Agricultural Research.
Global Forum on Agriculture. I missed the F and the A there. Global Forum on Agricultural Research. And the liaison to GODAN, which is a global open data for ag and nutrition, all about vocabularies and metadata standards. Please, Valeria, take it away.
So yes, I work for the Global Forum on Agricultural Research, but what I'm going to present here is a project on which we, together with many other partners, are working. Okay, I guess the slides are not up yet. Yes. And this is a project on which GFAR, together with FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and other partners are working under the umbrella of an initiative that's called GODAN. And Matthew just said it's the Global Open Data Initiative for Agriculture and Nutrition. A few words about GODAN. It was created out of a G8 conference on open data for agriculture, and it was launched in 2013. It was launched by two governments, the UK and the US, but then other governments joined, and above all, a lot of other partners from different types of stakeholders joined. So we have the private sector, the industry, we have also civil society, we also have international organizations, and also institutions working on open data and on research. And we have now more or less 500 partners. GODAN focuses on high-level advocacy work. So they do high-level advocacy with governments, with the big industry, but they also facilitate some more practical activities with more tangible results for better interoperability of data. And among those, some of the initiatives are around semantics. So what matters here in this session. And one of these initiatives that GODAN facilitates is it's an interest group in the Research Data Alliance. I don't know if you're familiar with the Research Data Alliance, But there is a lot of work also in the agricultural sector, in the food sector, in the RDA. So if you don't know it and if you've never worked with them, it may also be worth joining the RDA, because there is an interest group on agricultural data, and there are also working groups inside this interest group, working on semantics, working on specific types of data like wheat data, rice data, etc. And that's one part of the practical work that Godan facilitates. The other part is a project funded by DFID, the Department for Development of the UK. And this is about improving the usability of data. And one of the deliverables is a global map of data standards. And this is what I'm going to describe today, because it's a global map of data standards for food and agriculture. So it's not exactly only about food, but of course, everything that, not everything, but at least 60 or 70% of what relates to agriculture also relates to food. And out of this map of data standards, the objective that we have is to analyze gaps, what is missing, also what is overlapping, what efforts are being made, and if there are overlapping efforts, and we can perhaps avoid duplication, etc. What does this map of standards cover? What do we mean when we say data standards? We adopted a very, very broad approach to data standards. For us, anything that describes that formalization of a way of describing, linking, categorizing data is a data standard. So this coincides a little with the definition of the W3C, where the definition of vocabularies that the W3C does. It's everything that describes. So the examples are the standards that you can see here. I guess all of you have worked with some of them. Thesauri are perhaps the easiest type of standard that people are used to. But we also have ontologies. We also old-fashioned lists of reference values. Those are data standards. ISO specifications, many of the ISO specifications are data standards. So we adopt a very broad approach to what we want to cover in the map of standards. Oh, blah. The purpose of this, we found this very nice sentence here, which I literally copied from the purpose of the DCMI, the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, for their DCMI registry. They have a registry of vocabularies, so the concept is quite easy, quite similar, but it doesn't cover all disciplines in food and agriculture. And the purpose is the same as our registry. It's to promote the discovery and reuse of vocabularies, because this improves data interoperability. The more vocabularies are discovered, they are reused, the more interoperability you have with the data. The second objective is that it will help us identify overlapping efforts, as I said, duplication, and perhaps foster more collaboration in creating data standards. This is the current status of the map. These are just a couple of charts that show you more or less the distribution of data standards across different categories. There are a lot of categorizations that we use in the map. You can find data standards by the type of data, which could be an ontology, a thesaurus, etc. You can also find standards by domain, the type of data that they cover, the format, and a lot of other criteria that we use in the map. What do we have about food? That's one point. We don't have much. So we started the map asking experts to contribute and help us identify useful standards for specific domains. We didn't have much input on the food area. So one thing that I'm doing here is asking for the contribution also of other experts to tell us what other important standards exist. This is an example of what the standards that we have already in the map. You can see the variety of standards. We go from very simple, lightweight ontologies used by schema.org, or not even ontologies. These are really properties that are in the schema.org vocabulary. The DBpedia and also the BBC have ontologies for describing food, very simple. This is more for the general public, it's not scientific. But we also cover standards from normalizing organizations, or organizations that can issue standards that then are followed almost worldwide, like the ISO specifications or standards issued by FAO, the WTO, regarding food products, for instance. And then also more advanced projects in terms of technology, in terms of, semantic technologies, like ontologies created in projects in the last years, like Foodon, like the Foodie ontologies. These are all projects developed in the last years with the latest semantic technologies. So we cover several types of standards, but of course not everything that exists yet. These are just some more details about, these are the cards that you find in the system about each standard. One of the challenges that we have is that we know that there is a lot of work ongoing that we are not documenting because those standards have not been published. But the reason why we want this information to be also available in the map is in order to foster collaboration, the best way is to collaborate before a standard is published. So we're also working to identify standards that have not been published yet, but we know people are working on them. And perhaps before they're published, they could look for more collaboration from other partners that are working on similar standards. So we found out about some ontologies that are still under development. And my last slide is about calling experts to action and help us and contribute new data standards to the map. Thank you.
Thanks, Valeria. And transitioning now, you'll see that the AgroVoc vocabularies have been combined with a couple other vocabularies by this master of semantic web standing next to me, Tom Baker, who has a background, basically drove the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. And we use this all the time. You may not realize it, but when you use the internet, you're interacting with Dublin Core metadata all the time because almost all of the resources that are on the internet have been tagged with the standards that were put in place by the Dublin Core Initiative. And Tom's latest work has been on the Global Agricultural Concept Schema. So thanks, Tom, for coming, and looking forward to this.
Okay, thank you very much. So we started off with three large organizations, the FAO and the National Agricultural Library and CAB International. Each one of these organizations has a large thesaurus that they've built over several decades to index their literature. And we noticed that the most frequently used terms were held in common. It's this small area, and we over a course of a year, we created something called Global Agricultural Concept Scheme that comprises the most frequently used terms from these thesauri. So because it's a semantic web vocabulary, it uses URIs, or web addresses. It uses web addresses as names for things, as names for concepts. So to take the example of the concept grain, grain has this web address here, and it has labels in 25 languages, which we got from AgroVoc. So corn in German and Cerno in Russian. And it's related to broader concepts like cereal products and narrower concepts like brewers' grains and cereal grains. And grain, the product, is related to grain crops, the organism. So this is what Global Agricultural Concept Scheme is made of. It's made of concepts labeled in many languages about very general, high-level concepts in agriculture. So we see this as part of a semantic ecosystem. And so the next step, as we see it, is this Global Agricultural Concept Scheme is already mapped to the three thesauri. Now we want to map it to other types of vocabularies, taxonomies, ontologies, and we want to do this partly in the context of a community called Agri-Semantics, which is supported by a project called AgroPortal. And we want to use the VEST map of standards, which Valeria spoke of in the previous talk. So to visualize relationships between vocabularies. So what is GACS good for? Well, GACS is good for tagging literature. And so if you want to search for literature about grain, GACS concepts can be used to tag journal articles and reports and news. And recall, these concepts are have tags in multiple languages. So if you're searching for an article about sticky rice and you're working in Peru, you can find an article about sticky rice in Korea if it has been tagged with the web address of the concept sticky rice. So it's also used, we also want to use this for tagging data. And so GACS can be used to search for data. It could be used to tag spreadsheets, sensor feeds, data sets, field data on agriculture. And it can be used to find data sets that are tagged with these generic, commonly used concepts that we find in grain, in GACS, such as grain. But part of the semantic ecosystem is to map GACS to more precise domain ontologies, which model a particular domain, such as crops. There are more specialized concepts for experts, by experts. So the crop ontology has grain weight with units of measurement. The trait ontology distinguishes grain weight from fruit weight and pod weight. And those can be used to tag the same sensor feeds, spreadsheets, and data sets. But they can also be used to harmonize data on grain to make it easier to aggregate data from different sources. So, partners, the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition, GODAN, is the coordinator of this activity. The three partners that founded this are CAB International in the UK, FAO, and National Agricultural Library. Now we have new partners joining, the Institut National de Recherche Agronomique in France, Syngenta, the CGR, and AgriPortal. And basically, we see this as a community of organizations that are interested in mapping to GACS and in helping to build this agri-semantics community. In general, I think the one takeaway message from this is that so GACS is a set of very general concepts, concepts like cow and rice, and ontologies get into detail that can be used to make more precise conclusions, precise reasoning about data. And in a healthy ecosystem, both types of vocabularies are necessary because in a multilingual world, with people coming at agriculture from so many different perspectives, it is really impossible to think that one can be both precise and generic at the same time. So the solution is not to choose to be either generic or precise, but to be both and to map between the two and use those two to describe agricultural information. Thank you.
Thanks. One more slide. Thanks, Tom. And you know, Tom mentioned that we need to link with domain ontologies that are more precise and more specific. One of those ontologies that's being built is called food on, which is very precise language to describe food and all of its aspects. The most recent aspect of building food on was done by Damien Dooley. He's a scientific programmer at the Xiao Lab at the University of British Columbia. And he's here to tell us about merging food on with a language that's been developed on this side of the ocean called Langwall. And please, Damien, take it away.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah.
I'd like to also thank the Italian Trade Commission, ITA, for having me here, and the Seeds and Chips conference organizers. So, Food On and Langwall, I'm kind of combining them into one because Langwall is about 90% of Food On at this point in time. First, I'll say that this is a consortium project involving several different partners, and each of them are bringing their own desires into it. Robert Hohendorf, interested in chemical and nutritional analysis. Pierre Buttigieg, into sustainable development and food webs, not just about human food, but other organisms. He is Matthew Lang, of course, in his Semantic Web of Food, Health and Sustainability. And our lab, Xiao Labs, very interested in public health and simplifying the analysis and sharing of public health data around outbreaks. So the motivation for us to get involved in this ontology work is in dealing with researchers and public health agency epidemiologists that are trying to describe and identify pathogens quickly, and they are using lots of forms to interview their patients. But of course, the people, health agencies around the world are all solving the same kind of problem, and we are at the moment looking at, in this case, a CDC form, interview form for foodborne pathogen, identifying when the symptoms happen for a patient, the kind of food they ate, where they got it, whether it was imported, and so on. How is it that we can actually share, how can we share these forms? How can we share the underlying data that's driving these forms? How can we analyze foodborne outbreaks that occur across borders? This brings into play the top-level organization of a food ontology, the categories that you place food products and items underneath. And this particular diagram is from one study produced by epidemiologist, researcher interested in identifying from an epidemiology perspective how food should be organized. I'll just note that for epidemiologists, the problem is not just individual ingredients, it's also complex foods involving several different ingredients, lasagna, egg salad. But it's not just epidemiologists we're trying to make happy with a food ontology. We also have these other upper-level food categories, schemas from both Europe and America, and internationally, the GSC1, Global Product Classification, USDA standard reference. So creating a food ontology hopefully can encompass and provide a home for foods that can fit under all of those upper-level schemes. So we've turned to Langwall, a product of several years in fact, 30 years of development, starting in about 1975. Began as the factored food vocabulary out of the USDA's CFSAN research group. It's evolved over time, used both in America and across the Atlantic. Was named in around 1995, Langual. And it's a way of describing, according to several facets, individual food products. And we'll just take a look at what kind of categorizations on the next slide. Right. So Langual and Foodon are a three-tier structure. At the very top, you get to categorize your food according to a particular international standard that you want to support. You're not forced to just choose one. The next level down is all about the particular products that you're talking about, and at the very bottom are the raw source ingredients that go into those products: animal, plant, fungi, and chemical. So typical food has several facets of description, and here we have a possible consumer, the kind of relation that that food product, whether it's broccoli or steak, what part of the organism it is that you're referring to, the various commercial and processes, preservation method, container or wrapping, packing medium. The wonderful thing is that Langual has had about 30 years of work in curation to develop these categorizations. So we converted Langual into OWL, the OWL ontology platform. The project is part of OWL Obo Foundry, family of ontologies that try to coexist and describe biological and medical data. And we have over 2,500 raw ingredients in there. And as well, we make the link between each food item and its taxonomic organism, kind of information that scientific labs and genomic sequence repositories are interested in. I'll just give you a very quick glimpse at a day in the life of an ontologist. We've got here a protege, a tool for editing ontologies. Here's the label for a term, the definition, other annotations that you might want to make. And you get to structure your ontology in a hierarchy. And so diving into food source here, taking a look, these are the categories, preservation method, one of the elements that we're interested in as epidemiologists. But here's a dive into the hierarchy according to find one food. Oh, sorry, closer, sorry.
Yes.
Finding one food in the hierarchy and finding other categories that it's placed under, as well as a bit more of a logical definition, which helps out in validating the ontology. Here's a link off from the common name of a food, borage, off to the taxonomic scientific organism categorization. Now the thing is, these ontologies are very complex to the extent that logicians can really push the limits on the validation of them by defining terms in specialized relationships. But we want to bring this ontology vocabulary out to government and industry and public health settings where people can describe their own data and share it. And that's going to need some tools outside of the ontology editing world. And so we're just trying to create lists of things that people can use in order to make pick lists to describe the columns of data and spreadsheets, practical work. So into the future, there's a Siren database of 9,000 foods that we'd like to see that we're importing into the ontology, and uptaking that list of foods, starting to refer to that list, allows data sharing across countries, across the planet. We'd like to be more sensitive to the cultural origin and variation of foods, add specialized domains from researchers like that Matthew has employed on particular domains. Map to GACs, Tom's effort, or different categories of food. And for Robert Hohendorf's group, get into recipe description. And this last slide just fires through the fact that we know the food ontology project really has massive vocabulary implications across many different domains, and it's always a process of just trying to figure out what the limits of the problem you're solving is as you get into this work. So the thanks to the various agencies that have supported our work in the last year. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Damien. All right, and then now we're into the next part of our panel here. We're going to hear how these vocabularies are being put to use in actual business cases. So the first person to tell us about ontologies and another technology that's part of the Internet of Food, which is blockchain, is Raja Ramachandran. He's the CEO of Ripe.io. Thanks for coming, Raja, and please, it's all yours.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks for everybody in the audience for showing up today. We'll talk a little bit about how blockchain is a technology that may help revitalize and actually change a lot about transparency, the way that we actually reconnect back with our food, how we actually take a hard look at a way that we have that relationship with food. And so, as we look through it, all right, if you can get one of these to go. Anybody?
Are you on the PC, Mac?
There we go.
Okay.
So first things, I hate to use this slide as sort of a starting point, but we've heard a lot about it today. Honestly, we really don't have any idea what our food's about. Partly it's because of the lack of transparency. Despite the fact of a lot of labeling, a lot of knowledge, it's still not enough. And then what? And then when you ask to it, you hardly have any idea of how that food gets to you. You know, so less and less you actually know about what's going on with it. Let alone once it gets into a store, into the package, do you really know what's inside of it? So the idea is to take a connection back to your food. And how do you do that? You do that with language. You do that with communication, which is what you've heard today from a lot of very, very smart people about who've taken the hard work of taking complexity into a way that we can actually do something about it. So today, if you look at it, this is our food system. Our food system is this miraculous sort of disparate functioning thing where you've got farmers, you've got distributors, you've got processors, you've got kitchens, you've got all these people, but they're not connected in any meaningful way other than the fact that you get food at some point near the end of the day. We believe that our technology, the blockchain, what it does is it brings the language of food, the data of food, so that you can have the trust of food. And that's what the blockchain really means. So we're going to bring it down to something specific that we're working on today, the quest for a better tomato. In other words, what's that language, what's the data that actually help identify the factors that make something really good about a tomato? So first of all, yes, food is organic. It's an organic matter. It has mass, it has color, it has a whole series of things that make food. But the reality is it's made up by a wall of words. These wall of words are what you've seen from the panel today. Ontology, taxonomy, all these different things. And so from that perspective, we took a slice of life and said, well, how is it that if we're going to bring in that ontology and that set of words, how does it relate to tomato growing? How does it taste like, how does it take into advantage tomato taste? So we'll take you through a little bit of a journey. What blockchain does a very, very good job of is once you identify the language, once you identify how it is things are curated, grown, transported, placed into bins, brought to you, what happens is you can look at things like taste. And what are those words, what are those activities that make it up? What about traceability? Well, where was it? Do you have a device that actually tracks it? What about food safety? How is it reported? Can you detect it? Sustainability. How do you define energy consumption, water quality, and so on? So in essence, the blockchain actually provides a sequential way in which to manage all of this data. So for example, today, an important factor in understanding a quality of tomatoes, temperature. Well, how do you get temperature? How do you define it? How do you actually figure out a way to do all that? You have to look at the soil. You have to look at the field temperature. You have to look at the air ground temperature. You have to look at the pallet all the way to the dock. You have to track these things. We do today. We actually are connected directly from the blockchain to the sensors. That gives us a radical amount of information so we can help predict what's going to happen with this tomato. Another important aspect is moisture. In terms of understanding how humidity affects these things. And so when you look at moisture, you have to define it again. What happens in a truck? What happens to the pallet? What goes on in the dock? Last but least is light. Again, a series of words that associate itself with places in which light's going to occur and affect the growth of any type of produce, whether it's at the field, whether it's at the shop, whether it's at the loading dock. And so by having all this information, you can actually do something about it. And sorry, let me get back to this slide. So again, you can actually do something about it. So with all of this data, you then have an ability to analyze, actually do something with it in terms of, can you improve yield? Can you actually reduce waste? Can you look at the origin or the authenticity of what was done? Can you create better food? Is there a reduced risk from food safety? So then what you do at this point, what the blockchain enables are outcomes. By having the language of food, the data of the food, and a custody of that food, then you can start to look at, well, how do I achieve sustainability? Do I get it from my soil health? Do I get it from water quality? How do I look at food safety? Are there ways in which we can combine the efforts of our farmers, the transporters, the folks that pack these things into a way that it's safe, that has lengthier shelf life, that actually does what we want it to do? Taste great, keep us safe, keep us healthy. Traceability, one of the more difficult things to actually do. It's one thing to recognize that it started at our farm, but as you can tell from this slide, there are a lot of different factors in terms of where it goes. It's not just a truck, but it could be a handler. It could be a separate shop. It could be multiple hops that it finally gets through to the grocery store. And even there, you're finding differences in terms of how this is like managed, that it ultimately gets to you. Things like taste. We're working on right now as part of our program, how is it that if you can capture a lot of the specific data around sugar, salt, acidity, whatever it might be, can help come up with tomatoes that are curated against salads that in terms of preference, or they become tomato sauce and so on. And then in the future, an area that I know Matt's really interested about is health. One of the things we'll start to track at some point is nutrition, and so you have to look at proteins, minerals, the items that actually make it, that comprise the health and the output for nutrition for anybody that does. So all of this is actually placed in a technology that we call a scorecard. This allows us to actually break down each of those items into a real usable thing, whether you're a grocery store, you're a farmer, you're a transporter. And so if you look at the farmer, we want to help them on a couple of different dimensions. If you farm well, you should get paid more. You want to improve your yield, you want to reduce waste. If you are a transporter, certainly proof of origin, transport logistics, reduce risk are all these different things that are extremely useful. For the grocery store, the buyer, increase their branding capability, take a harder look at traceability, not only from farmer to the store, but everything in between. Authenticity being equal. And then for you and me, shelf life, better food, increased information. All of that gets brought to the blockchain of food. And so to summarize, if we take the language of food, if we combine it with the right kind of data capture, whether it's coming from a sensor, a database, someone manually talking to us, you combine that into real outcomes, sustainability, taste, nutrition. You then have what the blockchain of food does, which is collects the information, takes the consensus of all the different players in the field, and then you create records or blocks that then become permanent records. And through those permanent records, you increase the integrity of the food supply system. That's something that we look to do for this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Raja. That's amazing. So now we hear about blockchain technology where we can deposit essentially data emerging from sensors together with data that's been annotated with standardized vocabularies into essentially a permanent record that we can all trust. And we move now from that kind of technology into another kind of technology that's also producing data, but it's a little bit different. And so we're going to hear from Sasan Amini, who's the CEO of Clear Labs, about how they're using a variety of omics technologies to ensure authenticity around food. Please, Sasan.
All right. Thank you, Matt. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here. I have to admit, we are cheating because unlike many of the people in this panel who are behind creating a vocabulary to use here, we are already relying on a vocabulary that exists in nature, and that is DNA. So Clear Labs is an analytics genetics platform for the food industry, and what we do is that we rely on something that Mother Nature has created. That is called DNA, and it has 4 building blocks, A, C, G, T. So if we can find a way of reading the identity of these building blocks, we can pretty much decode the information in that DNA. And that technology is called DNA sequencing. It is not something new. It had been around for almost 2 decades. But what has happened is that over the past decade or so, the cost of next generation sequencing has dropped dramatically, almost 6 orders of magnitude. So when US government started sequencing the first human genome back in 1995 to 2000, it cost them almost $3 billion to do 1 human genome. 2014, the cost dropped to $1,000. And this drop in cost has enabled so many new applications that we can actually start seeing in the food. So the main difference that next generation sequencing has compared to many of the legacy type of approaches that were being used is that number one, it is not targeted. So pretty much you can cast an infinite net, meaning that you can almost look for all possible anomalies that are present at the DNA level in the food, and you are not limited to only look at one target. So with all those power that we observe in next generation sequencing, we have started applying it to real world problems that exist within the food supply chain. And today I'm gonna actually focus the remaining time of this talk on talking about 3 use cases. One of them is around food transparency and authenticity that actually Matt has started talking about at the beginning of the session. The other is the implication around public health that is very related to the work that Damien is doing. And the last one is around food analytics. So starting with food transparency. Raja set the stage for me by asking the question, what is in the food, right? So let me start with asking a couple of questions. I start picking a few common ingredients in food that I believe most of the audience in here resonate with. And I want to ask a question, what do you think these common food items are being substituted with in the food supply chain? So the first example that I have is pepper seed. I bet you almost every single one of you use pepper or consume pepper as part of your daily cuisines, right? So what we have found is that actually papaya seed is commonly being used instead of pepper seed, and it's actually being mixed with. So that's actually something that many of us might have actually consumed over time, and we actually never knew about. The other interesting use case is wheat flour. Wheat is the foundation of pasta, is the foundation of pizza dough, right? And so many people love to actually have something based on wheat. It is very common for us to observe actually the wheat-based compounds are substituted with rye flour. And rye happens to be much cheaper than wheat. So this is actually another clear case of food adulteration. Calamari. Is there anyone in the audience whose favorite food is calamari? Because I usually ask this question because sometimes people actually blame me that I ruined that experience for them. But what we have seen is that in many cases, pork intestine has been actually substituted with calamari. The last example, saffron. I believe that is a very common ingredient in risottos, right? That I had actually one very nice dish yesterday in Milan. One interesting point about saffron is that the global consumption of saffron is 5 times higher than its production on an annual basis. So you just do the math, right? So on average, most of the saffron that we are actually consuming is not actually saffron. One of the very common alternatives is corn silk. People can actually take the corn silk and pretty much dye it, and you will not be able to tell the difference. So what I'm going to actually highlight here is that having a technology like a DNA-based solution that pretty much relies on the whole concept of semantic web of food. It's a universal way of reading information, enable us to do all these broad type of discoveries around the authenticity of the food. The last example I have on authenticity is around some of the processed meat patties that we looked at in the United States. So we looked into almost 400 different processed patties that are either expected to be veggie, turkey, lamb, pork, chicken, or beef. Every arrow that I show here shows one or multiple incidents of major substitution that we have observed. So again, as you see, if you don't have a universal vocabulary to read all these different sorts of substitution, there is no way for you to uncover that. So moving on from the first use case that was the food transparency, I'm going to actually talk briefly about public health. So as you know, on an annual basis, many people actually got impacted by a foodborne illness. I bet you even in this crowd, at least half of you had been hit by some sort of a food that got you sick very, very bad over the past year or so. So if you look at the global stats that we are dealing with, 600 million people annually get sick. Almost 500,000 people die, and 40% of them happen to be elderlies or children. So what actually this technology has enabled us to do is actually start being a lot more proactive about foodborne illness investigation. So there was a program in the United States that got us started back in 2013 called Genome Tracker. So what happens in Genome Tracker is that CDC, or Center for Disease Control, actually identifies people who are getting sick from a foodborne illness. So they isolate the bacteria that got them sick, and they sequence that bacteria. So they exactly know what is the identity of the bacteria. On the other hand, we have USDA and FDA in US. What they do is that they identify what type of pathogen exists within the food environment. So when you have both sides of the equation, then connecting the dot is very, very easy. You can easily say that these people got sick because they consumed this type of product. So this plot actually shows actual data that CDC and FDA used to spend on a single outbreak, food outbreak investigation. So as you can see, the average number of days we spend is north of 30 days, historically, and almost 1,000 people get sick per one incident of foodborne outbreak. Yeah. Post-adoption of Genome Tracker, this window has been actually squeezed down to close to 10 days, and only 12 people get sick. So the main reason this type of innovation has been possible now is because, again, we have a universal way to look into the people who get sick, but also to look into the cases of food that are contaminated and connect the dots. So again, going back to the whole universal vocabulary. The impact of this technology was so big that Barack Obama highlighted this in the White House impact report before leaving the White House last year. I'm not sure tomorrow is going to cover this or not, but I just wanted to highlight this part. And the last part I would like to cover before wrapping up the talk is around food analytics. As you know, we are looking across a wide range of analytics in the food. So that covers allergens, unexpected ingredients, expected ingredients, probiotics, pathogens, ingredients, and lots of metadata around the country of origin or many other things that actually are important for the food. So the question is that, can we start connecting the dot and create a model that is more predictive about quality of the food? So let me give you one example. Probiotics are a big area of research or marketing in the food industry. Most of the food companies would like to say we have more probiotics in our food, and this is good for your health, right? So let's just focus on one example, Lactobacillus acidophilus. So as the name suggests, it grows well on lactose-based environments. So if you pick up the phone and call any food scientist that you know, which food product I can consume that have more of this ingredient, I bet you 99% of them tell you consume dairy, or consume yogurt, or consume cheese, because these are the products that have loss of lactose. What we did was to go back to our database and ask the question, which ingredients has the maximum level of this bacteria? And guess what? The first answer was not a dairy-based product. It was blueberry. The second answer, again, not a dairy-based product. It's cranberry. So I can give you so many examples of how having a universal vocabulary can actually enable you to start doing lots of discoveries around food. One last example is around organic versus non-organic. As Raja was showing up, the definition of organic is super broad. And up until now, there hasn't been a single way to test for organic product. What we have noticed is that actually the community of bacteria living on an organic product could be very distinct from the community of bacteria living on non-organic product. And you can use this discrimination in order to identify what is organic, what is not organic. So to wrap up, this is pretty much the team behind Clear Labs, and all these presentations haven't been possible without their efforts and contribution. And I would like to thank the organizers again for making this happen.
Thank you, Sasan. That was beautiful and super interesting. And I'll never eat calamari again. You've assured that. So we've seen how ontologies can be used to tag data coming from sensors, how we can tag data related to omics and genomics, in a variety of use cases related to sustainability, related to traceability, and related to transparency. But we can also use ontologies for fundamentally driving artificial intelligence. And we can use those, and we can do that for improving health. So here to talk to us today is CTO, Chief Technology Officer of Wellio.com, Eric Andrenko. Please, take it away.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today to tell you about teaching machines how to cook and how to cook healthy food from reading the web. First, a little bit more about me. I'm actually trained as a mathematician. I consider myself a data scientist now, but don't worry, there won't be any mathematics at all in this talk. And I've spent the last several years in my career applying data to practical problems in the agricultural and food world. And in particular, I spent many years building decision support tools for agriculture. These are tools that farmers would use to make more informed decisions about managing their crops, especially managing their crops in the face of changing climate. Excuse me. And I had an experience when I was cooking for my family, which I usually do because I like to cook. And my daughter asked me one day what she should eat to be healthy. And I thought that was a good question. She's about to turn 8. And I gave her what I thought was a reasonably good answer. And then I thought about it a little more, and I realized I didn't actually know the answer to that question. Because when I searched on the web, the articles that I was reading were typically contradicting other articles I was reading. And it turns out that there's a pretty substantial problem in the world related to nutrition and obesity. And that is this number right here, which is by 2050, it's expected that 1 out of every 2 individuals on the entire planet will be obese or overweight. And there will be many places in the world where simultaneously there will be problems with obesity and undernutrition in the same geographies. So that just I found astounding. So together with a colleague of mine at the beginning of this year, we co-founded a company to build an intelligent assistant for eating well, and to enable access for people in the world to have access to intelligence about culinary facts so that they can eat food that is healthy. To me, that's eating well. And also access to nutritional information so that they can eat food that's eating well. And we think about this intelligence as really being applied in 3 different areas: inspiration related to eating, discovering and finding interesting things to eat that work, empowerment related to eating well, finding and sourcing ingredients that are healthy, and sustainable, and then supporting, in particular, support for eating healthy at home. And then finally, the most important aspect of an intelligent system, adapting to and reacting to the world around it. So first, let's talk about inspiration. This is built upon all of the work that we've heard about this afternoon in terms of building a large semantic data collection around food and culinary facts and nutritional facts associated with food. And this is very multidimensional. So this is information about food content, information about preparing and cooking instructions, information about the health impacts, macronutrient quantity, and everything else. And this is built by reading the web, starting with all of the high-quality label data that already exists in the web due to some of the ontologies we just heard about, and then augmenting that when there's data missing using machine learning. And then finally, mapping that to human intention expressed in the form of natural language queries. And these can be things that are related to interests in the moment, as well as things that are longer-term interest over time. And then further, enabling those same individuals to interact with and share their food experiences in the places where they already do today, such as Instagram and other places, and using that as an additional data source for learning. On top of this, we also provide support to empower people to procure ingredients to make their meals and also get expert assistance while cooking. So from a recipe, we know which ingredients are required. We know where those ingredients can be sourced, and perhaps most importantly, which ingredients are already in the kitchen or in the individual's garden, so they don't have to be sourced, reducing food waste. And then while individuals are cooking in the kitchen, if they would like some assistance from a culinary expert, they have access to that assistance. In particular, one thing that I find fascinating is that many of the voice-activated intelligent assistants that are in homes, in fact, more than half of the Amazon Alexas are in the kitchen. So it's a natural place to have a conversation about what is being made and to get assistance. And then finally, what's essential, I think, for any intelligent system is adaptability. That is to understand longer-term goals and aspirations and to react to the situations as they change related to those goals over time. So someone maybe would like to have more variety in their weeknight dinners, which is very common. And that should be taken into account as we recommend recipes and other ingredients for that user. And then we should learn from their feedback and their experiences over time which of those approaches are going to be successful and which of those approaches are not going to be successful based on their feedback that comes both explicitly or implicitly. And I think that as a society, we really need to consider both feeding the world and nourishing the world. And I think that we can do this by applying the data that we have collected so far and intelligently applying data science to decision support on the day-to-day basis. And if we can positively impact the billions of decisions that are made about food every day, I think that we can truly go from feeding the world to nourishing the world. Thank you.
All right, I think we have just enough time for a couple questions. And Eric, since you're holding the mic, I'm going to pick on you.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned reading the web and building up your knowledge base from reading the web. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and what you're doing there?
Yeah, I can. We're using deep neural networks. I don't know if people are familiar with those technologies, but there's a tremendous amount of content that's food related, especially from many of the millennials that we heard about this morning, that are tagged or annotated in some way, but it's typically incomplete. So there are millions of recipes on the web that are annotated with some information, but not complete information, as an example. And you can augment the tagging and the level of fidelity of the tagging using machine learning approaches. One thing that I find very interesting is that we trained a model off of recipe data that could then be used to categorize food terms as being similar or dissimilar to each other. And if you give a machine learned model nothing but a data set around food, particularly recipe data, and you ask it which food terms are closest to Parmesan cheese, it will pick out all of the other Italian cheeses on its own, just from the way that the words are used in natural context. So I knew we were onto something when I saw it. That was a fun time.
Are you saying from where the recipes are used, like how people are using the other cheeses,
Yes.
you're able to identify the cheeses that are most similar to Parmesan
Yes.
based on how people are using those recipes?
Exactly, and if you have additional labels and you happen to know that those are dairy products, then it's very easy to extend one type of cheese labeling as a dairy product to other types of cheeses as a labeling as a dairy product. So you can expand the vocabulary and the structured data, and then you can use that to support decision making. So if someone says, I don't eat dairy food, you know that they don't eat Parmesan cheese, for example.
I see. And so does that mean then that that calamari, and maybe Sasan can answer this, or both of you together, and sliced up pork intestine are closely related?
Well, no, and I don't think they should be, but I don't know how one can help.
Do people use, would your system pick up something like that as being an ingredient substitution or similar, or?
No, they would be similar as in they're both animal products, but I can tell you that calamari is not very close to pork, nor should it should be.
Right,
in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'm glad your system is smart enough to know that.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you to my wonderful panel. You guys have been great, and I hope we offered for you, the audience, an opportunity to discover a little bit more about the semantic web of food and everywhere we're going. And thank you again to our sponsors, SOP and Seeds and Chips. I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic rest of the conference. So, thanks.